Hello, my name is Francesca Ruscito, and I'm a defense scientist at the Department of National Defense with the Director General Military Personnel Research and Analysis. The topic of this presentation is Succession Management for Public Affairs Officers in the Canadian Armed Forces, Competency Dictionary and Functional Job Descriptions. In 2005, the Government of Canada and the Chief of Defence Staff shaped a transformation for the Canadian Armed Forces, outlining a change in their vision, objectives, and capabilities to better meet the emerging security demands in Canada and abroad. In alignment with the new vision, Chief Military Personnel initiated activities that would support how the Canadian Armed Forces understands leadership. The transformation emphasized the need for the Canadian Armed Forces to better educate and train their leaders so as to ensure that the right individuals will be identified, trained, and well prepared to take on senior positions. This therefore necessitated a review of the Canadian Armed Forces' current succession planning. Succession planning is a process that allows for the identification of current and future leadership requirements in order to ensure leadership continuity necessary to organization success. It encompasses the identification of key positions at various organizational levels, the identification of future leaders, and leadership development. So why is succession planning important? The answer is really in the benefits it provides to the organization. Succession planning allows an organization such as the Canadian Armed Forces to ensure that the right individuals will be identified, trained, and well prepared to occupy senior positions. Now, in order to understand succession planning in the Canadian Armed Forces, it's important to understand its structure. So, as you can see, the Canadian Armed Forces is organized by environment, the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, each with a rank structure whereby officers begin their leadership journey at the junior ranks and slowly work their way up to the more senior and general flag officer ranks. In order to move up the ranks, officers need to demonstrate a certain level of proficiency. So proficiency levels refers to groupings of competency-related behaviors that progressively increase in depth and scope as required for successful performance at ever more strategic jobs. So in general, as officers move up in proficiency level, their behaviors change from the tactical to the more strategic. It is important to understand these proficiency levels because we will be using them later on in understanding the new succession planning model. Currently, each environment in the Canadian Armed Forces, the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force, has their own annual succession planning board for choosing members to fill a position. Typically, eligible candidates have their electronic personnel file thoroughly reviewed and scored by members on a selection board, and the individual who is ranked as number one most often by the board members becomes the primary candidate for the specific command appointment that he or she is considered for. Now, although the environments have been able to prepare members for operational command positions, they have not been required to prepare their personnel for strategic leadership positions. This has therefore resulted in gaps in general officer development. And it became quite evident that a new way of doing succession planning in the Canadian Armed Forces was needed. Therefore, in an attempt to address the gaps in leadership development, the Canadian Forces Leadership Institute introduced a new and coherent conceptual framework for leadership and professional development aligned to the Canadian Armed Forces effectiveness, and this is known as the Leadership Development Framework. CFLI developed the Leadership Development Framework in order to attempt to articulate leadership effectiveness at the institutional level, as well as to generate leader capacities that would support leadership effectiveness when implemented. So the framework contains 5 meta-competencies. These are professional expertise, cognitive capacities, social capacities, change capacities, and professional ideology. And it reflects the competencies that Canadian Armed Forces leaders should and will need to possess in order to lead the people and the institution in face of new and future challenges. The Leadership Development Framework was later endorsed as the base on which to anchor relevant human resource activities such as the Canadian Forces Performance Appraisal System and succession planning, including recruitment, performance appraisal, promotion, and career management. However, given the theoretical nature of the framework, it needed to be operationalized in order to be used. And the most effective way to operationalize it was to develop a dictionary of competencies based on the 5 meta-competencies we just saw. So a competency dictionary was developed by consulting competency documents from several other federal government departments, as well as conducting preliminary studies within the Canadian Armed Forces. So a total of 19 competencies were generated, each with its own clear definition and set of related behavior indicators. These are those behaviors that are key and required in order to perform effectively in the job. Each competency reflects a meta-competency from the Leadership Development Framework, and the dictionary will be used to create personalized competency profiles with required proficiency levels needed to perform in a particular job at a particular rank. In conjunction with the Competency Dictionary, it was determined that the development of functional job descriptions for all main categories of job families would be useful tools for improving succession planning in the Canadian Armed Forces. So the functional job descriptions will include the knowledge, education, training, and experiences necessary for an officer to be effective in a certain job. This additional information about a job will allow for a better assessment of personnel in identifying their strengths and weaknesses, as well as be able to recognize future leaders and prepare them for such roles. So the Public Affairs branch of the Canadian Armed Forces contacted my department, which is the Director General Military Personnel Research and Analysis, for assistance in developing the functional job descriptions. The Public Affairs branch was looking for help in facilitating their talent succession management efforts at the specific rank of Lieutenant Colonel Commander. So all 11 public affairs officers were recruited for participation. Upon review of their terms of reference, it became evident that some jobs could be grouped together into job families. So a total of 8 different job families emerged. These were known as Head Defense Public Affairs Learning Center, the Commandants, Director Public Affairs Chief Military Personnel and Legal Services, Director Public Affairs Operations, Chief of Media Operations, Issues Management Public Affairs, Public Affairs Attaché, and Staff Officer. So once the job families were determined, an interview protocol and questionnaires were developed with the aim of determining the competency profiles, as well as the education, training, and experience required for successful performance in that job. Prior to the interview, participants were asked to complete a ranking questionnaire designed to identify the core and critical competencies required of Lieutenant Colonels Commanders for their job. Job incumbents were asked to choose up to 10 core competencies, rank order them, and then choose up to 5 critical competencies. Participants were also asked to complete the readiness questionnaire, which was used to assess their readiness levels in terms of training and experience to carry out the duties and responsibilities of their current job. Job incumbents were asked questions such as, identify knowledge domains necessary for your particular job, how prepared were you to start the job, identify any tasks you were not prepared for, and recommend the types of training or experience officers should be given in order to better prepare them. One of the primary sources of data collection was the interview. The data collected was used to identify the competencies that are critical to the job being targeted. The interview portion of the study consisted of asking participants to describe the main responsibilities of their job and to describe their day-to-day activities. This was followed by questions pertaining to the competencies from the dictionary. Now, given the limitations, only 4 competencies were covered during each interview. And during the interview, participants were asked for their feedback on the definitions of the 4 competencies and to describe how they demonstrated them in their day-to-day activities with concrete examples. Finally, they were asked to describe the differences in work between their rank and the rank below them. Each interview conducted as part of this study was recorded and then transcribed in its entirety. The content of 11 interview transcripts was examined and analyzed to refine and validate the competency definitions of the Competency Dictionary. The analysis was also used to determine the competency profiles and proficiency levels. Now, the profiles consist of both core competencies, those competencies required of every Lieutenant Colonel Commander independent of the job he or she occupies, as well as critical competencies, which are those competencies required of Lieutenant Colonels Commanders specific to a job family. So the competencies were determined by a combination of both qualitative and quantitative analyses. The researchers individually read the interview transcripts and extracted information pertaining to the competencies, along with the proficiency level at which they were being demonstrated. The scientists then regrouped to reach consensus and to compare their findings to participants' responses on the ranking questionnaire. It was decided that the competencies found to be between proficiency levels 3 and 4, ranked in the top 10-11, and which were consistent across all job families, would comprise the list of core competencies. So preliminary analyses of the results revealed the following 11 core competencies for lieutenant colonels commanders: commitment to military ethos, credibility and impact, communication, analytical thinking, action orientation and initiative, interpersonal relations, teamwork, organizational awareness, visioning, resource management, and results management. In addition, those competencies which were frequently mentioned and were ranked high by respondents within specific job families made up the critical competencies. So for example, the public affairs attachés would most probably need partnering and behavioral flexibility as critical competencies for their job. The job description and responsibility section of the functional job descriptions were developed by consulting terms of reference, general officer specifications, public affairs officer occupation specifications, and the portion of the interview which asked lieutenant colonels commanders to describe their key activities and responsibilities. So for example, some of the responsibilities of the public affairs attaché are provides advice and guidance on all public affairs matters to the commander, and sustains, develops, and improves defense relations with the host country. And these, of course, will be validated in the next phase of the study. In order to discover the minimum amount of knowledge necessary for successful performance in the current job held by the lieutenant colonels commanders, the participants' responses to the question about knowledge domains necessary for their job were analyzed. So if we look at again at the example of the public affairs attachés, we can see that they require knowledge of international relations, defense security issues, communications and media, finance, and so on. The levels of knowledge required for each job family will be determined also in the validation phase. The readiness questionnaire responses were also analyzed in order to determine both the education training and work experiences required of lieutenant colonels commanders for their current jobs. So for example, the public affairs attaché stated needing training in policy development, in social media, as well as prior experience working with other government departments and so on, in order to be effective at their job. And these two have yet to be validated. So each of these sections that I have just shown are replicated for each job family in the public affairs branch. Therefore, each of the job families will have their own unique critical competency profiles, knowledge domains, education training, experience, and job descriptions. So the functional job descriptions and competency profiles were developed for both training and development purposes. As I mentioned, the next step of the study is to validate the functional job descriptions and the competency profiles at the rank of lieutenant colonel and commander. Once those are validated, assessment tools can be developed, which will be used to identify gaps in the majors and lieutenant commanders' competencies, because the majors and lieutenant commanders are the one rank below lieutenant colonels. So by identifying their gaps, it will allow for the succession planning of officers by better preparing them for the next rank of lieutenant colonel commander. Thank you very much.